Welcome back to the Blackletter Podcast. We set out to create an entertaining and exciting podcast about law and business. Blackletter, the name, comes from the Gothic typeset. Over time, Blackletter became the only font that English law books were printed in. It made it harder for kind of the common person to understand what the English law books said. Blackletter came to represent something that was law, that was set in stone, that was sort of old and a well-settled fundamental principle of law. We're here to demystify black-letter law. We're here to demystify things that happen in business and law and where those two meet. And I hope you have fun listening. Welcome back to another episode of the Blackletter Podcast. Today with me, I've got Aaron Jackson. Aaron is a former military officer, veteran, a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, and is now a partner at a national law firm, same law firm I'm at, in fact. But what's more exciting than all of that is that Aaron has written a book called Cynical, and we're going to talk a little bit about Cynical. I'm waiting for my signed autographed copy, so when I get that, I'm going to deep dive into the whole thing. But for now, I'm going to ask Aaron first. I've introduced you to Aaron, but tell me about Cynical. What's in it? What's it about?
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, thanks for having me, Tom. And I'm holding your copy of the book. I will sign it, and I will send it to you. You'll get it shortly.
Yeah, some kind of with love, or like to the best lawyer I know in the DC metro area, or something like that.
You must have read my mind because it's already there. Yeah, no. So the book is called Cynical: Overcoming America's New Mindset with 7 Principles of Hope and Humanity. And what I do, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, I'm sure, in just a little bit. But what I do is really expose the concept of cynicism. You know, we use the word all the time. Maybe I'm just being cynical about this. And we use it almost flippantly. But the reality is cynicism, being cynical as a mindset, is a very, very destructive thing. And we just don't realize what it means when we say we're being cynical. But if we took some time and if we thought about it, we'd realize that it's a whole lot worse than we realize. And I make the argument that as a nation right now, we have largely embraced a cynical mindset. We as a nation have become cynical, and it's led to a lot of destruction. And I think we see it. We see it in our homes. We see it in our workplaces. We see it in our local and our national neighborhoods. And it's time we do something about it. And so that's what.
So is this book about being more cynical or less cynical?
Yeah. So the first part is all about understanding what cynicism is. Okay. And then it shifts to a leadership book, and it's all about being less cynical. What do we need to do as leaders to own the problem, to see it for what it is, and do something about it? Again, in our homes, in our workplaces, in our neighborhoods, we can do something about it, but we have to embrace a new mindset of hope and humanity.
In the context of something that's real, at least it's very real to me, because I'm not happy with any presidential candidate personally. And I don't mean to inject personal opinion, but I think a lot of America feels that way. And I don't know that we're cynical. We're just tired of who we've ended up with as choices, right? It's tough. And I'm not asking for your political opinion, but am I being cynical? And how do we take your book in the context of, for example, this presidential debate, put to use the book and those leadership lessons? Help me.
Yeah. That's a great question. And it's a good curveball, but I think it's one that's addressed in the book quite a bit as well. I think it's important to note up front that the book is apolitical. I don't take issues on either side. This is not a one side does it, the other side does not. This is we all do it. We are all guilty of this stuff from the lowest levels all the way up to the presidency, right? It's kind of an American epidemic right now. I don't think you're being cynical. I think what you're doing is you're observing the realities of what's going on right now, and you're making some assessments. And I don't think that's being cynical. What I use, it's a very simple definition in the book. Okay. Cynicism, when you break it down, what it means to be cynical is to be contemptuously distrustful of human nature or individuals kind of writ large. Right. And you can be cynical about yourself, by the way. And I would argue that you are your worst cynic. We all are. But the two words that I want to latch on to are distrust and contempt. Okay. We think of it this way. If I were walking into the courtroom, Okay. I am the first time I'm walking in, I'm innocent, right? Until a panel or a jury decides beyond a reasonable doubt that the evidence has demonstrated that I am guilty of whatever it is that I'm alleged to have done.
Okay, right? I'm with you. A crime of some kind.
Yep. Yeah, right. Not so with cynicism. With the cynical individual, imagine it as being that individual that walks into the metaphorical courtroom already condemned, guilty, detested. And for what? For one reason, and that is I know something about you. And that one thing is enough for me to make judgments about you all the way down the board. If I find out that you watch this particular news source or you vote in this particular direction, that's all I need to make judgment on you, right? And in my mind, in the court of my opinion, you have been judged and condemned because I know this one thing about you. And the reality is we are so much more complex than that. We are a combination of thousands and millions of different moving parts that beautifully make you who you are and me who I am. And that's worth exploring, right? We need to get away from the idea that because I know one thing about you, I can make that judgment and I contemptuously distrust you, right? And it's not only that I distrust you, it's that level of contempt. I use in the book, I don't know if you've ever read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, but he talks specifically about this. There's a psychologist by the name of Dr. Gottman who did a lot of work in this area. And he found that when it came to couples that were looking to potentially get divorced, there were four general themes, right? Four general things that he saw that kind of more prevalently led people to decide to divorce as a couple. The number one thing, clearly, statistically demonstrated by the facts, was an idea of contempt, right? If that couple expressed contempt towards each other, it was by far the number one predictor that their marriage was doomed to fail. And so when we say contempt, I mean this idea of superiority, right? Because of you, because of who you are, not only do I disagree with you, not only do I no longer trust you, but I have made the judgment that I am superior to you in some way, right? And that level of...
I gotcha. Yeah. This is what we see in politics now, though, too. You see one party saying, well, you're a weak liberal because you're not strong on the things like defense and immigration, or you're a crazy conservative because you don't want too many. So we see the exact same thing. There's so much contempt at the extremes.
Yes.
For so many Americans in this country, it's so hard to find a middle ground. And it seems like we don't want to find a middle ground. So, sorry, I'm hijacking this because it weighs on me heavily.
Yeah.
Heavily. As a former Army officer, January 6th weighs on me heavily. Like how we swore to the guy. Anyway, so what led you to this? Tell me about the background. What led you to write this book? Yeah. I see the issue, but how did you come to this?
Yeah, so, it really started for me while I was still active duty. This has been a labor of love for me for several years now. So if you went back probably about 5 years ago now, I was still on active duty, and I was deployed to an undisclosed location in the Middle East. At the time, I was head legal counsel for let's just say it was the organization that had more air operations happening in the Middle East, in that AOR, than any other area. We were kind of spread out, multiple different locations, but our headquarters was at an undisclosed location. And so I found myself in some very interesting times on the other side of the world, doing the business of America, at a time when the Islamic State was wreaking havoc. So this was about the time, if you remember, the Islamic State was in Iraq and Syria. They were amassing huge swaths of territory, destructing, killing, murdering, raping, just terrible things. And so our operations were focused almost exclusively on eradicating that threat, right? And our number one goal at the time was focused on recapturing Raqqa, right? And so we were doing some very serious work I say on behalf of America, but really, quite frankly, on behalf of all of the, thousands and millions of citizens that were terrorized by this horrible group, right? And so I'm working 14 to 16 hours a day. It's hot, it's dusty, and I'm in the thick of it, right? And so I found in my deployed experience that there was really three places that I could get some sort of rehabilitation, right? To sustain myself, to keep me motivated and energized every day to continue the work. And it was pretty simple. I had the gym, I had the chapel, and fortunately, our location had pretty good communications, and we had the TV. We had 4 channels, right? And so I spent a lot of time in the gym. I spent a lot of time in the chapel, and I spent a lot of time watching the news. That ultimately became my source of revitalization. We had 4 channels: a sports, a movie channel, a military channel, and the news. And I found that sports was a fantastic way to reconnect with the United States. But your sports team wasn't always on, right? Nobody watched the military channel except for some funny commercials that they had every once in a while. And the movies were really hit or miss, right? So I found that when I had a moment to kind of recapture some time, I found that I was watching the news. That was my ability to reconnect with the United States, the nation that I love, back home, despite the fact that I was half the world away doing some really difficult things. It was my effort to rehabilitate, to sustain, to uplift, to motivate, right?
So what news channel was it? I have to ask.
You know what? The great thing was they were all of the news channels. It was one source, but they would kind of cycle through different news sources. So it'd be half an hour to an hour on CNN, and then Fox News and MSNBC, and all of them really. So, but what I found, despite which news source I was at, right, regardless, what I found was my hope of getting motivation and uplifting and everything else. It was the exact opposite. It did not motivate. It did not uplift. It did not sustain. In fact, what I saw as a service member on the other side of the world, watching my home engage with each other, was the reason why I wrote this book. And the reality was, man, are we cynical. We are just a cynical people right now. And you can see it a lot. You hit on it. It doesn't end with politics, but you can certainly see it in our political climate right now. But it pervades every aspect of our lives these days. We're cynical in our homes. We're cynical in our workplaces. And we're cynical in our local, and you see it, national neighborhoods. The mindset of cynicism and that contemptuous distrust we have for our fellow citizens is everywhere. And we got to do something about it. We need to expose it for what it is. And we need to tackle this as a serious leadership and, quite frankly, national security issue. And we need to do something about it.
So what do we do? What are the 7 principles, or what's the answer? What's the answer to all of our problems there?
I propose 7, and I'll tell you, these 7 are not all inclusive. They're not an exhaustive list, right? The 7 that I propose are 7 very serious things that we need to get after, but there are a lot more. And I would encourage anyone who's listening to this podcast, who reads the book, keep thinking, right? Keep building on this 7, right? But the 7 that I target on, I call them the 7 C's. They all start with, kind of C. But it starts by creating cause, right? We need to create purpose and meaning in our lives, right? There's a really good TED Talk that recently came out. And the realization was, despite the level of affluence that we're seeing in America and other similar countries, right? We have a lot of good things going for us, right? We are an affluent people, big houses, big cars, lots of comfort, right? And the reality that this particular individual saw was, it's not helping. We are more depressed. We are more isolated. That's not leading to better lives. And the conclusion that this individual had was, we're lacking meaning. We're lacking purpose. We're lacking cause, which is hilarious because I'd already written this chapter well before. And so she was just speaking to my heart language. So the first one is, we need to create cause. And then we need to deepen connections with one another, right? We live on the surface, which leads to us feeling very isolated and very kind of ignorant of the people that we have surrounding us, right? Our neighbors, even our family and friends, right? We need to deepen the connections. And then we need to allow for communication, real communication. We live in a social media age where we feel as soon as we type something and send it out into the ether, we have effectively communicated. And the answer is no, we haven't. We've only gotten about half of the way to real communication. So we need to begin to understand what real communication looks like and start practicing that in our lives. And then we need to work on finding commonality, right? You go back to those political conversations that we were having earlier. And those in particular, we need to find commonality with those that we disagree with. I mean, the reality is, I would imagine that even people that I would maybe disagree with principally on lots of issues, I would find that if we took the time, if we got to understand each other, if we got to understand what the issues were and what we hoped the end result would be, that we would have a lot more in common than we realize, right? And so we need to find those points of commonality, and we need to latch onto those as a way to connect us, right, as human beings. And then we need to embrace conflict. We are in a day and age that finds that all conflict is kinetic, and it's not. Conflict is a beautiful thing. Our Constitution was made for conflict. Conflict can be incredibly constructive if we allow those constructive conversations to happen, right? So we need to embrace that. We need to also demonstrate courage, right? We need to demonstrate courage as we engage one another. And finally, we do all of these things and we can begin to change the culture, right? So those are the seven C's: cause, connection, communication, commonality, embracing conflict, demonstrating courage, and changing the culture. That's what it's all about for me.
That's beautiful, Aaron. That is fantastic. I'm excited to get my copy. I'm excited to read it. It looks like something I can digest. It's not, Ken Follett, Pillars of the Earth, 800-page book. So I'm glad for that, and look forward to it. I'm frankly not a huge fan of the cynics of ancient Greece. I know the meaning of it is transformed over time. I don't want to live in a jar on the streets of Athens like Diogenes. He's like the second original cynic. I'm sure you're familiar with him. I think it's a funny. Anyway, sorry, I digress. I'm excited for the book. I think it's super interesting. And again, I frankly agree with you. I don't think it'll be easy. And sometimes I think that if I am a conservative and I say something, even if a liberal person would tend to agree with it just because if they knew I was conservative, they might immediately disagree. And there is this tendency, and I forget who the author was, a book that recently came out about it, or if I'm a liberal and I'm like, I think that, getting diseases is bad. And a conservative might say, well, no, diseases can be good because they strengthen immunity. But if another conservative said it, they'd be like, you're right, disease is bad. Disease is objectively bad. But if somebody's saying it that you don't like, who's identified themselves as one tribe or the other, you're cynical about that person. You're superior because so I get it. Man, it's a hard thing to solve.
Yeah.
And maybe if we blow up social media, figuratively, of course, I'm not saying getting kinetic, but
yeah, I would say some of the hardest problems are the best problems, and they're the ones that we need to start working towards. So, I kind of make the argument in the book that we really are kind of living in a World War I era of trench warfare, right? Where you have your trench and I have my trench, and we don't peek over the edge. But there was a beautiful
They played
story.
soccer at Christmas. Remember the Germans?
That's in the book.
Wow.
We need to embrace. Yes, that's exactly right. We need to embrace
play soccer at Christmas.
Eve.
Football.
Yes. That's right. So. But they met in the middle, right? And they found a humanity and a hope in that moment that we need to just latch onto. If you can do it in the middle of a world war, then we can certainly do it today. And we need to start doing that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Aaron. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Blackletter Podcast. Aaron Jackson, his new book, Cynical. You can get it on his website. I know this because I looked today and get on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, You can get it everywhere. It's out there. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you on the next episode of Blackletter. Download us wherever you get your podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, iTunes, whatever you like. That's all for today's episode of Blackletter. Thanks again for listening. Join us next time when we talk about more Blackletter issues in creative ways. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and check out our website at blackletterstudios.com.